Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome back.
Hey, welcome back. It's been a minute, but we are back. For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
That's right. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you are bringing us back to the table.
Yeah, we're back.
What have you brought for us to talk about today?
I am bringing a documentary called Class Dismissed, which is not to be confused with our podcast description that says classes in session.
That's right.
So, yeah, this isn't the end of the episode, folks. If you're just getting started, I know it's been a couple weeks, but everything, we're just kicking it off again.
The
all right?
jokes.
Yeah, welcome back. So this is about political, economic, and cultural class.
Yes.
And it's about the ways that television reinforces our societal stereotypes and thinking about class. This documentary is from 2005, and it's based on a book by Pepi Leistyna, who was a professor of applied linguistics at UMass Boston. And does some really great interviews throughout the documentary.
Absolutely.
The analysis in this film it's great throughout, and they bring in a variety of people to talk about a wide range of identities and experiences and how those things intersect with class. Mm-hmm. So since the film is from 2005, some of the examples are a little bit dated.
Yeah.
And they walk through like sort of a history of television almost. Like they go back to the early days, like
black and white TV.
Yeah.
I mean,
Beverly Hillbillies. That's what I was trying to think of. And,
Yes.
and then, through the 70s and Archie Bunker and all kinds of stuff.
all the way up to the 2000s. I mean, all the way up to the film. Yeah.
They show some examples of things that were current at the time. Like King of Queens, I think, was on there.
Roseanne was on there. Yeah.
Yeah, and a few things from like late 90s, early 2000s, early decade.
Yes.
whatever that should have been called. Shaking the rust off, folks.
Yes.
But so the analysis, I think, still lines up a lot with what we can see on TV and streaming sites today, though.
Absolutely.
And a big part of it is that we generally don't mention class at all, in media, but also in sort of conversation in life in the U.S. And when it is mentioned, it's usually from a limited perspective. So it's great to watch something that makes you think about that. And one of the early points in the documentary is that it pushes us to consider how our entertainment shapes our thinking.
Right.
But yeah, so what did you think of it? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree. I think this is definitely a great watch, and it's just a great documentary. And I think, we spent some time when you brought this to me, we watched the trailer to make sure that it was still relevant, given that, it came out in 2005. But as you said, the analysis, I think, still applies today, right? There's still a lot of relevance to everything we're still experiencing to this day presented in this film. So I think both from a television perspective and also in our daily lives and our culture and our lived experiences, right? And so I definitely encourage people to check this film out. If folks want to check it out, we should remind folks, I think we did this when we introduced it, but you can find it on Canopy, which is just a really great app, I think, to have in your library. There's lots of incredible films in this app. And I think we're excited to see what else we can find from it.
Yeah, and you can connect your library card to it. But you haven't done that, right?
So I'm using my work email.
Oh, okay. So yeah, you can connect your local library card, and lots of local libraries are subscribed to this service, and they've got a ton of documentary films, but also lots of movies and other things to watch too.
That's right. I was thinking for our purpose, but yes, there's lots of movies out there. To start, though, I think one of the things I really appreciate in this documentary, and I like when films like this one do this, was sort of early on, it provides a conceptual framework and a definition of class.
Yes.
Right, which I think is incredibly important so that we're all operating with some common understanding, right? And so the film featured, or this part of the film featured, Barbara Ehrenreich, who is an author and political activist, and Pepe, who you mentioned earlier. They provided some great information and context on the framework for and the dimensions of class that I thought it important that we sort of talk about here, right? That we share. So there's economic class, which is your income, your accumulated wealth. There's political class, which is the power one has to influence sort of the political process, the public process in our society. And then there's cultural class, which includes things like your education, your taste, your lifestyle, sort of this idea of cultural capital, right, that a person has. And one of the points that Pepi makes about the dimensions of class that I think is so important to recognize is that these things are sort of always in flux for a person and for a society. And so therefore, so is the definition of class, right? And one of the other incredible people that this film featured was our friend, Robin D.G. Kelly. If you're listening, come on the show. He went on to sort of expand on that notion, right? One of the central arguments he made was to talk about the concept of capitalism. And I think it's easy to recognize, and we've talked about this here on the show before, right? That when you think about capitalism, it's easy to see how class can and has shifted and changed over time, right? So there was some just really great context from this film that is still so important and so relevant to today, right?
Yeah, and I think you talked about they jump in with a conceptual framework in defining the different elements of class early on, which I think is so important because we don't generally have that sort of definition of things. Because we don't talk about it at all. And so we think about class only in that way. And I think we'll actually talk about this today. The way that the definition of class has evolved over time to simply mean like what your paycheck looks like and how much is in your bank account and the kinds of things you have in your wherever you call home. And that being all of what class is. And so it's nice for them to define that and get...
Yeah, and that was such more of a sort of thorough definition, right? In context for us. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing that stuck out to me was this concept that gets... it's about how class sort of disappeared and is no longer really present in the media. And it's connected to the McCarthy era, which was, if you know much about it, rabidly anti-communist. And they took that view as broadly as they could. So they applied it to anything that could be even remotely seen as communist, which means they applied it to labor unions. Which created a backlash against organized labor. And that's then seen in the way that media is produced, and that those kinds of working class depictions, which had been seen in the earlier days of television, disappear and mold into something else. And we can see that influence, I think, through to today, where class has been shaped into the things you have, right? Like I said, or what you have in your bank account, rather than about power and access you have to political structures or things like that. And then there's also, they talk about this, the way that TV sort of merged more with advertising to create this idea about how class is the products you buy and what kinds of material things you have and what you can buy for your home. So it's vilifying this idea kind of the way that we can understand how we're connected through shared class experiences across the structure of our economy, in favor of us trying to chase being content with the stuff that we have, and the ways that plays out for us individually, right? Like it's sort of a process of individualizing us and separating us from each other in terms of thinking about how we have shared class experiences, even if it's in different positions or have different access to stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's definitely the analysis of this. And one of the things you said was talking about sort of how TV and the shows and the media shifted to or combined with advertising. And I think it's fascinating to think about. I can't remember which film it was, but it talked about, you know, the matriarch of the house and what vacuum cleaner she was using in certain scenes, right? And, you know, folks sat at home and watched that and thought, well, I need that vacuum cleaner, right? And so, you know, I guess I had never really thought about that when you know, that was like sort of an interesting concept to sort of see when I think of advertising and sort of capitalism and consumerism. I think of commercials, maybe, right? Like true commercials or, you know, back in the day, radio ads. But that absolutely is an advertisement in, you know, situated within the context of a TV show or media.
Yeah. Well, and I think it happens so frequently now that we don't notice it as much, right? Like
it did give me pause. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I think about all the ways that I see like Apple products show up in a TV show.
Yes.
And sometimes it's, you know, blatant, and sometimes they've tried to hide that it's an Apple product. You're like, well, yeah, but
I know.
Look at that industrial design. that's a MacBook.
That MacBook that I have sitting right here too. Yeah, I know it.
So yeah, that's an interesting thing to maybe think about too, is like, was the impact of that bigger when that concept was sort of introduced, of like prominently displaying that this is a Hoover vacuum or whatever it was. I don't remember.
It probably was.
Versus, you know,
what we know now,
it's like everybody's. We just sort of expect it.
Absolutely, you know, the Starbucks cup in the Game of Thrones scene, accident or not. That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. I think every point you made there was really great. It was really interesting to see how this film pointed out and recognized and the promotion of class changing over time, right? One of the things, I can't remember who was talking about this, but that whole conversation, that section of the film just made me think of my family. And back in the day, you know, there's this saying, it still exists, right? Like this idea of keeping up with the Joneses, right? And so much of that absolutely has to do with how the media has influenced what is, this is maybe the wrong way to say this, like truly important in our society, right? Or what is valued and what is not, right? And where you need to be in a certain situation or in your class. And so I think all of that was a really great point. And I think it connects so well to another central point of this film, such great points in this film, around the working class in this country, right? And that so many people in this country, in fact, the majority of people in this country, right, are working class people, right? And whether or not they identify with that label, that moniker, right, is another topic of discussion in the film. But it means we have so many people in this country who are working more than one job to make ends meet, right? And the film talks about this, and that still exists today. And people have to work more than one job to sort of keep up, right? Keep up with the Joneses, keep up with society, keep up with the harsh and often unrealistic, I think, capitalist demands that this society has of us, right? Or just to be able to survive, right? And you know, that was the case when this film was made, but it still applies today, right? It has such an impact on our lived experiences and beyond, I think.
Yeah, and I think, you know, part of that is we have to keep up with, you know, rising price and cost of things.
Yep, that too.
And wages that haven't grown to keep up with that.
Absolutely.
There's somebody shared online a job posting from 14 years ago.
Okay.
And they had saved it. They were applying, they were doing a job search process, and that was part of their documentation, that they saved the job posting that had a salary range of $30,000 to $40,000.
Okay.
The salary, that job, same department, same institution, was just reposted like recently.
Oh boy.
The salary listed was like 34 to 42.
Wow. 14 years later.
14 years later. And, you know, 30,000, the low end of that range 14 years ahead now. So $2009, $30,000, right? $2023 is $42,000 and change. God. So the low end of that range should now be $42,000, but it's not. It's like I forget what it was, but it was 32 or 40 or 32 or 34 or something like that. So we have to keep up because our jobs aren't keeping up.
Absolutely. With the cost of living. And
exactly.
The cost of just trying to exist. Absolutely.
And so, kind of connected to this, kind of not, was this idea of the myth and ideology of social mobility,
Yes.
which was described by Stanley Aronowitz. So back before the 1980s, he mentioned this statistic that 25% of the working class could move beyond their class origins into a professional or managerial position or class status, right? And so this amount of social mobility, 25%, not a ton. It's not an overwhelming amount. It's not a majority, not close. That was enough to create a mythology and an ideology. And so I'm paraphrasing him here. The ideology is that anyone can move beyond their class origins, and the mythology was that it was up to the individual's efforts to do so. It was a personal question,
Yes.
is what he said. Which obviously doesn't match up to the experiences of people in the structures of capitalism in the U.S. It doesn't acknowledge the structures of the economy and the structures of the economic system of capitalism, particularly the United States brand of it. And so, we don't talk about the stringent class stratifications we have, as the film says. They mention this. We either want to believe that we are a society without classes, or we're all middle class.
Right.
And sometimes we want to say those things in the same paragraph, that we're both classless and we're all middle class, which is why we're classless, which doesn't, square.
No.
But the reality is class influences so much of our experiences. And, I think about the ways that our neighborhoods and cities are still very segregated in terms of race, but also in terms of class.
Absolutely.
Some of the depictions of like working class people on TV in the old days would not exist now, because like working class people don't live next to wealthy people,
right,
in general. But our neighborhoods, so the segregation exists so much that our zip codes predict a lot of information about how our lives will turn out, including average income levels, incarceration rates, marriage rates, and a whole lot more. There's a big study done about this. I don't remember when, relatively recently. You can find it at Opportunity Atlas, is the name of the project. And you can type your zip code and look up different elements of statistics of what happens to people in that zip code. That's wild.
Yeah. That's wild. Yeah. So, that part of the film was really fascinating to me too. I think there's such great connections between everything you've talked about today, right? This idea of McCarthyism, right? Media backlashes to labor unions, right? The myth of social mobility, the power of U.S. capitalism, right? Like there's such great connections between all of that. That is at play when we're talking about and thinking about class in this country. I also want to mention the other thing that this film points out, which is how certain politicians and the corporate elite, who we've seen over the years, are often colluding, I should say, outside of our collective best interest, right? And how they sort of initiated this idea of class warfare, right? And this idea of talking about class as this negative thing. I mean, someone in the film said that, the class was even seen by some of those politicians as a dirty word, right? And so this film does such a great job in pointing out how when you have all of these forces working together, everything you've sort of talked about as well, right? It's easy to see how all of this has happened, right? And where we are in terms of how we think about and talk about class, right? And I particularly think the notion of the conditions in which people find themselves in, and I love the mention of that platform. I think we should promote that. It's easy to see how we're there, given all of those forces, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think one of the examples was a political campaign.
Yes,
that they shared, talking about a reaction to somebody bringing up class and calling that class warfare. And it was something about I don't know. It was a program about helping working people.
Right.
So that's class warfare. All right, so this feels like a good spot to talk about application.
Okay.
How does this documentary apply in our day-to-day lives? I think this documentary is a really fantastic example of having a critical eye for the seemingly ordinary or mundane stuff around you.
Yes.
Thinking about what the narrative is that's being pushed by a reality TV series, which we take as just like, entertainment.
Yes.
Like, purely for the sake of entertainment. But that's entertainment that's being produced, and there is a message behind it, even if we can't see it.
Absolutely.
How are these media companies shaping the story of class or race or immigration? I think there's some great examples of current events going on right now with the strikes of the Writers Guild and the Actors Guild and the new contract negotiation for UPS that avoided a strike. And so, while this is obviously not reality TV or entertainment, I think we have to be cognizant of the tone these stories have. What's the subtext of the way that it's reported,
Yes.
and who owns the companies who are producing the story and who benefits from the way that the story is being told. Because a lot of these, what are they called? Places that produce media, TV.
Production houses,
the
media
studios.
company, the studios. Yeah.
That's the word.
Yeah.
Woo. It's been a long day, apparently. The studios are sort of co-owned by media companies who are producing news media.
Absolutely.
And so, following those threads, I think, is important too. And this documentary gives us some really great examples of ways to critically analyze media to read into the messaging of that media and make meaning for it for yourself.
Absolutely. Those are really great questions, right? I think for all of us to sort of think about, to be reminded of in terms of how important it is, I think, to be critical about what it is that we consume in our day-to-day lives, right?
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate those questions, that application. I think that's great. When I was trying to think about application, I was struck right away by sort of how this film opens. There's literally the first few words got me, and I jotted them down. So it says, the film opens by saying this: while television has provided a comfortable home for the middle class for over 50 years, many of its most memorable characters have been working class. While producers say that television is meant to entertain and not to educate, blue-collar shows have undeniably played a pivotal role in shaping our perceptions of working-class people. But because we see television as just entertainment, we readily disregard its impact on our thinking. It's precisely because we believe television is merely entertainment that we need to take its image of the working class seriously, right? And so that connects to what you just talked about. I thought that was a really great opening quote from this film, right? And it's absolutely the application of it for me. And I think, again, it connects so beautifully to the questions that you asked, I think. The other piece of application from this film that's, I think, connected to that quote, and we really didn't talk about this too much, I think, but the film addresses it, is the idea of the intersectionality between class and insert whatever you want to insert here, right? And so, the film talks about how class and race are portrayed in the TV and media, right? How class and sexual orientation are portrayed, right? One of the films was, the TV shows was Will and Grace, right? How class and gender are portrayed, right? And so on and so forth. And so, I think that opening quote from the film, alongside thinking about the intersectionality of our lived experiences and the ways in which they're portrayed in media, and all of your incredible questions, right, are just, important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about class, when we're thinking about our society. It's so important.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's such a, the documentary was so good at being really eye-opening to recognizing how all of that is working.
Right. And I'm so glad we brought it here, right?
Yep.
And it, even though it's from 2005, that the application is still relevant today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about homework. How will we continue to learn about this beyond our conversation today? There's some great interviews from people in this film,
Yes.
Including Pepi Leistyna, Robin D.G. Kelly, who we mentioned, Herman Gray, Susan Douglas, Michael Zwig, Barbara Ehrenreich, you mentioned earlier too, and a lot more. So I think my homework is just to try to narrow down that list at some point in the next few days. So learn more from one of these great people, whether that's a book or a film or an interview or something. I the analysis in the film, I think, was so good that I just want to learn more from the folks who were there and shared and played a big role in creating it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great. Such brilliant analysis from all those folks and contributions to this really large conversation about class, right?
Yeah.
Wide-ranging conversation about class in this film. And so I'll be intrigued to see what research you come up with, and maybe some of it can come to the table here, right? And we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I like it. So I'll co-sign that. I also think part of my homework is just to do some more work to continue to learn more and explore and think about sort of the present day implications and applications of class in our society, right? Like we've talked about some of that here, right? But this film clearly showed us that there's a lot more to learn, there's a lot more to think about. And, again, this is from 2005, right? And so I'm sure we could do a study on like looking at TV shows from 2005 till now and see sort of maybe where we've come, where we're going, what has changed, what still stays the same, right? And so, I would just be intrigued to continue this kind of exploration in the way that this film provided.
Yeah, like what is something like Succession existing or Billions?
Yes.
Like these shows that have narratives that exist with these fictional ultra wealthy people. Like what is this? What are the messages in that, right?
Yeah. Oh man,
yeah,
we both have watched Succession. I
haven't actually.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, okay.
I haven't watched it.
Well, you should watch it. And I am currently watching Billions. So
those are just the two that come to my mind. Of like
those are great.
Super, super, super wealthy people,
absolutely,
being like front and center in the show or in the whatever the narrative is. All right, great. That's good stuff. So. This is where we wrap it up, and you're up next time.
Yes.
So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Absolutely. Well, speaking of wealth, for our next episode, I'm bringing a piece from In These Times magazine to the table for us. Our friends over there published a piece called "Corporate Greed is a Moral Crisis. Working People are Fighting Back." So it's interesting how these pieces connect. This piece connects to what we just talked about today. This piece was published just earlier this month here in August. I can't believe it's August. It was written by Rosalind Pellis and William J. Barber II, who are actually both with the Yale Divinity School's Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. Barber is the founding director of the center, and Pellis is a lecturer there, in addition to her work as a labor organizer. And so I'm really excited to read this piece. It highlights some of the organizing work and the strikes that have taken place this summer by workers in a variety of industries, right? Like you talked about SAG and the Writers Guild, right? It mentions those folks, but a whole lot more. It talks about the fight against corporate greed, and certainly what could potentially and hopefully come from all of this organizing work, all of these strikes, the work of unions at the moment. And so I'm really excited to check this piece out and kind of continue this conversation. I'm sure we can bring in all that we've talked about today and what we've learned about with class in this too. And so, yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. William Barber picked up where Dr. King left off when he was killed and restarted with a bunch of other folks, the Poor People's Campaign.
Right.
In the last few years. He restarted that. So, I'm excited to read that and sort of think more about what has been dubbed by some folks the hot labor summer.
Hot labor summer, yes. I know that the piece also quotes something that we retweeted from the Working Families Party around the fourth leading cause of death in this country, right? And so there's some connections to things that I know we've both seen and feel strongly about, and are is just important to amplify and talk about.
Yeah.
So I'm excited. I'll get off my box now.
Oh, awesome. Well, excited to continue that conversation and continue to learn.
Yes.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for coming back here after a couple weeks off and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media. Check us out on YouTube, TikTok, all the places. Sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next time.